subject I want to speak about today is the rise of China. And I want to ask a specific question. And that question is, can China rise peacefully? And my answer to the question is no, that China cannot rise peacefully. And I want to tell you why. But before I get into the specifics of my argument, I want to put two caveats on the table. First, you want to understand that I am simply assuming that China will continue to grow economically over the next 20 or 30 years, much the way it's grown over the past 20 or 30 years. I'm not saying that that will happen for sure. And in fact, there are a good number of people who think that China is not going to continue to grow in the future the way it has in the recent past. I don't know what the answer is. We're just assuming here that China is going to continue to grow. So that's point number one. Point number two is, the only way you can answer the question of whether or not China will rise peacefully is with a theory. It has to be a theoretical question because we have no facts about the future. The future hasn't happened yet. So, for example, when I hear people in Washington say that they have just been to Beijing and they've talked to person X, Y, and Z, and after talking to persons X, Y, and Z, they're convinced that China can rise peacefully. I say this is a bunch of poppycock. I don't care what person X, Y, and Z told you. Person X, Y, and Z will probably be dead in 20 or 30 years, and the people who will be running China in 20 or 30 years are probably 15 years old today. And you don't know what they're going to be thinking in 15, 20, 30 years. You don't even know who's going to be running the country in 15, 20, or 30 years. Can you tell me who's going to be running Turkey in 30 years? Can you tell me what Turkey's strategic environment is going to look like in 30 years? No, you can't. Right? So this is a theoretical question. Right? And this is why IR theory is so important. Okay, now to the heart and soul of my talk. 3 parts. First, I'm going to give you my basic theory of great power politics. 2, I'm going to give you a synoptic view or a synoptic telling of American foreign policy since the founding of the country in 1783. And what I'm going to try and do in describing American foreign policy over the history of the country is convince you that my theory explains how America has behaved over time. Because anytime you lay out a theory, it's very important that you give people some confidence that the theory has explanatory power. So what I'm going to do is tell you in the second part of the story how America has behaved since 1783, all for the purposes of trying to convince you that it fits neatly with my theory. Then the third part of my talk is where I explain to you what I think China will do as it turns itself into a giant Hong Kong. And my argument, of course, is that I believe that China will also act the way the United States has acted. China will imitate the United States because that's what the theory says. The theory would expect China to behave much the way the United States has behaved. And of course, I can't just talk about what happens when China rises and how China behaves. I also have to explain how I think the United States will react to an ascendant China. So again, you see there are 3 parts to the talk. 1 is the basic theory, then 2, history of American foreign policy, and then 3, how China is likely to act in the future, and how the Americans and actually China's neighbors will react. Okay, so those are the 3 parts of the story. Let me start off with my basic theory of international politics. And I'm sure some of you are reasonably familiar with the argument, but for those who are not, I'll go over it in some detail. I start with 5 simple assumptions about the international system. I'm a structural realist, and I believe that when you look at the structure of the international system, you look at 5 assumptions. These assumptions tell you a great deal about how international politics works. The 5 assumptions are, first, that states are the principal actors in the international system, and there's no higher authority that sits above those states. As many of you know, this is what we call anarchy in political science speak. Anarchy. Anarchy does not mean murder and mayhem in the IR lexicon. Anarchy simply is the opposite of hierarchy. It's just saying that states are the principal players in the system, and there's no higher authority that sits above states. States are like pool balls on a table. That's the first assumption. The second assumption is that all states in the system have some military capability, some offensive military capability. Now, that offensive military capability varies across states. Belgium obviously has very little offensive military capability. Jordan obviously has very little offensive military capability. Germany, on the other hand, Israel, on the other hand, the United States, on the other hand, those are countries with a heck of a lot of offensive military capability. But nevertheless, Belgium and Jordan do have some limited offensive military capability. All states have some offensive military capability. That's the second assumption. The third assumption is of enormous importance, and I want to spend a little bit of time dwelling on it. It has to do with intentions. Remember, the second assumption had to do with capabilities. The third assumption has to do with intentions. And there, my argument is that states can never be certain about the intentions of other states. And the reason that you can never be certain about the intentions of other states is that intentions are inside people's heads, and you can't get inside people's heads and see their intentions. Very different than capabilities. During the Cold War, when I was young, like many of you in the audience, during the Cold War, we used to be able to measure Soviet capabilities. We could count how many armored division equivalents they had, we could count how many SS-18s they had, how many attack submarines, how many Bear bombers. These were material capabilities that we could see and count. We had huge debates throughout the Cold War as to what Soviet intentions were. It was very difficult to figure out what Nikita Khrushchev or Brezhnev was thinking at any particular point in time. And furthermore, we didn't know really who was in charge in the Kremlin. So how could we divine what Soviet intentions were at any particular point in time? Intentions are uncertain. Take this a step further. Even if you don't agree with me on that point, even if you think that we can figure out what the intentions of another country are right now, my trump card is to say, you cannot tell me what the intentions of another state will be in the future. There's no way you can know future intentions. You cannot know whether another state will have malign intentions or benign intentions. And this is not simply because intentions are in people's heads and hard to measure. It's because the future hasn't happened yet and you don't know what their intentions will be down the road. Let me give you a really good example that has nothing to do with international relations that illustrates this point. And it's actually a very depressing example. It has to do with divorce. Anytime two people get married, they invariably think that the person they're marrying is wonderful and is going to have benign intentions towards them forever. Otherwise, you wouldn't get married, right? But obviously, at least in the United States, we have a very high divorce rate, which means it doesn't work out. And in many cases, the person that you marry ends up, over some extended period of time, having malign intentions towards you. And if you think about this, when you get married, there's no way you can know for sure that the person you're marrying won't turn out to be Attila the Hun, and that you won't end up in a War of the Roses-like situation. This is not to say you can be certain it will happen. It's just to say you cannot be certain that the person you're marrying won't eventually have malign intentions towards you. Very depressing, but true. But the same thing is true in the international system. If it's 1919 and you're the Allies at Versailles and you're trying to think about how to deal with Germany over the long term, how can you know what Germany's intentions will be in 1929 or 1939 or 1949? How can you know that in 1919? It's not that you can know that they will have malign intentions, you just can't be sure. So the first three assumptions I've laid out for you is, number one, that the system is anarchic, which simply means there's no higher authority. Number two, all states have some offensive military capability. Varies across countries, but all states have some. And number three, you can never be certain about another state's intentions. In my opinion, you can't be certain now, and you certainly cannot be certain in the future. Okay? Those are the first three assumptions. The fourth and fifth assumptions are straightforward. The fourth assumption is that survival is the highest goal of all states or all countries. It's not the only goal, but it's the highest goal. For the obvious reason that if you don't survive, you can't pursue any of the other goals. If you get killed, you can't do anything else because you're dead. So survival always has to be the number one goal. Fifth assumption is that states are basically rational actors. They're strategic calculators. All of this is a way of saying that states are quite good at coming up with reasonably smart strategies for maximizing their chances of surviving. So those are the five basic assumptions that I make about the world, about the international system. Now you take those five assumptions, you put them in the blender, and you hit the on switch, and you mix them up, and you get three forms of behavior. The first is fear. All states in the system fear every other state in the system. The level of fear varies across states, but states fear each other. And they fear each other for two reasons. It'll be obvious to you once I spell them out. First of all, they fear each other because there's always a possibility you'll end up next to a state that has a lot of offensive military capability and malign intentions. There's always a chance you'll end up next door to Nazi Germany or Imperial Germany or Imperial Japan. The second reason that states fear each other is that if you get into trouble, there's no higher authority that you can turn to because it's an anarchic system. You know, in the United States, when you get in trouble and you want to dial the police, you dial 911. I like to say there's no 911 in the international system. You dial 911, you know who's at the other end? Nobody. Nobody. There's nobody to call. And that leads to the second form of behavior, which is self-help. States quickly figure out that in the international system, because there's no 911, because there's no higher authority, and because you fear other states, you have to take care of yourself. As I like to say, God helps those who help themselves in international politics. The third form of behavior that you get is you quickly figure out that the best way to survive in an anarchic system where you can end up living next door to a troublemaker, the best way to survive is to be really powerful. To put it in colloquial American terms, to be the biggest and baddest dude on the block. You'll be really powerful. Because if you're really powerful, nobody messes around with you. It's one of the great things about living in the United States. We have the Canadians to the north, the Mexicans to the south, fish to the east, and fish to the west. Nobody in America goes to bed worrying about any country attacking it because we are so powerful. In other words, if you're interested in survival, as I told you, survival has to be the principal goal. If you don't survive, you can't pursue those other goals. If survival is your principal goal, you're in an anarchic system where you can't be certain about the intentions of other states, and they may have one heck of a lot of offensive capability. You want to make sure you have a lot more offensive capability than that. You want to put it in political science speak, maximize your relative power. To put it in slightly different terms, you want to be the hegemon in the system. Now, very important here, I'm not arguing that you want to be the hegemon in the system so you can go on a rampage and beat up other countries. You want to be the hegemon in the system because that's the best way to survive. So that's what my 5 assumptions take you to. They take you to the conclusion that the best way to survive is to be the hegemon of the system. Now, I want to unpack a bit what it means to be the hegemon of the system. I believe that it is impossible to be a global hegemon. The globe is too big, and there's too much water. And it's very difficult, in my opinion, to project power across water. So you cannot dominate the entire globe. I believe that the United States has gotten itself into a lot of trouble since 1989 because it has mistakenly thought that it could be a global hegemon. My view is that the best you can do is be a regional hegemon. You can dominate your region of the world. I'll talk more about this in a minute, but the United States of America dominates the Western Hemisphere. Imperial Germany tried to dominate Europe. Imperial Japan tried to dominate Asia. So my argument is the ultimate goal for any state in the system is to be a regional hegemon. That's number 1. And number 2 is you want to make sure that no other state in the system dominates its region of the world. In other words, you don't want Germany to dominate Europe. Now you're probably saying to yourself, I can understand why he says that you want to dominate your region of the world, but who cares about whether another country dominates another region of the world? In other words, why should the United States care whether Germany dominates Europe or China dominates Asia? The answer is that if a country dominates its region of the world, it is free to roam. It is free to roam into your backyard. I often say to American audiences, have you ever thought about why it is that we, Americans, run around the entire world sticking our nose in everybody's business? You ever wonder why that's possible? The answer is because we have no security threats in the Western Hemisphere. There's no country in the Western Hemisphere that is a military threat to the United States. So we are therefore free to roam. And you, Turks, are well aware of how much roaming we do. There's no place on the planet you can go where people are not aware of our ability to roam. Well, if you're the United States of America, you do not want Germany free to roam. Why? Because it'll roam into the Western Hemisphere. You want Germany to be pinned down in Europe, worrying about the Russians, the French, the British, and whoever else you can concern them with. The same thing is true with the Chinese. We do not want a China that is free to roam the way we are free to roam. So again, given my 5 assumptions, what you end up with are 2 goals. The first goal is to dominate your region of the world, 1. And 2, make sure that no other country dominates its region of the world, because then it's free to roam in your backyard. To put this in Pentagonese, that's a foreign language we speak in the United States, to put this in Pentagonese, you don't want a peer competitor. Okay? That's my theory. Now, what I want to do is give you a thumbnail sketch of American foreign policy from 1783 up to the present. And what I want to convince you of is that our behavior fits very neatly with my theory. When the United States got started in the late 18th century, it was comprised of 13 small colonies strung out along the Atlantic Ocean. Over the course of roughly the next 60, 70 years, the United States marched across the continent, stole huge amounts of land from the Native Americans, murdered huge numbers of Native Americans in the process, went to war with Mexico, and stole what is the southwest of the United States from Mexico. We invaded Canada in 1812 because throughout the 19th century we had our gun sights on Canada and believed that Canada should be part of the United States. The reason Ottawa is the capital of Canada and Toronto is not the capital of Canada is that Toronto was very close to the American border, and the Canadians thought we were going to pay them a return visit, and they didn't want their capital to be conquered. So they put it in Ottawa rather than Toronto. Furthermore, we would have expanded into the Caribbean if we could have, but we could not because of the slavery issue. As you know, there were lots of slaves brought to the Caribbean because that's where the sugar industry was concentrated. And sugar, tobacco, and cotton are labor-intensive industries that required lots of slaves. Therefore, the northern states in the United States were adamantly opposed to conquering territory in the Caribbean because they thought that would result in more slaveholding states coming into the Union. That's the only thing that prevented us from conquering territory to our south. And as I said to you, we would have gone further north. But we went all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and we created a very big and very powerful state. And then we opened the gates to immigrants who came in and filled that country up. That's the first thing we did. Second thing we did is called the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, old President James Monroe told the European great powers, "This is our hemisphere. You're not welcome here. We're not powerful enough to throw you out now, but we're eventually going to throw you out. And after we throw you out, you are not welcome back here." It's the Monroe Doctrine. First part of the story was all about manifest destiny. That was where we conquered a huge chunk of North America and created this state. Second part was the Monroe Doctrine. That was getting rid of the Europeans once and for all. By 1898, in the wake of the Spanish-American War, we had established regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. We were, and still remain, the only regional hegemon in modern history. That was done on purpose. There is no country in modern history that has a record of conquest that looks as good as ours. It is no accident that Adolf Hitler admired the United States of America greatly. He said, these are people who know how to create Lebensraum. The United States is a ruthless great power. It always has been. So that's the first thing that we did. Right? We created hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. As you know, I said there's a second thing that the great power wants to do to maximize its relative power, and that is to make sure it has no peer competitor. Fortunately, there were no potential peer competitors in the 19th century. In the 20th century, there were 4 potential peer competitors: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the former Soviet Union. The United States played a key role in putting all 4 of those countries on the scrap heap of history. As I told you, the United States will not tolerate peer competitors. We do not. We're number 1, and we plan to stay number 1. That's the way we operate. We don't talk like that. We have all these liberal rhetoricians who tell stories about our great values and our belief in freedom and so forth and so on. But that's all just liberal cover for what is basically ruthless behavior. We do not tolerate peer competitors. In World War I, when it looked like Imperial Germany was going to win the war, we entered in April 1917. If I had another 2 hours, I would make the argument that we provided the tipping mechanism that allowed the Allies to prevail in that war. We helped finish off Imperial Germany, and then at the Treaty of Versailles, we defanged Germany for at least the next 15 years. World War II, we played the key role for sure in defeating Imperial Japan, and putting that country on the scrap heap of history, and we contributed to defeating Nazi Germany in Europe. The Soviet Union, of course, played the key role there. And then when the war in Europe ended in 1945, and the Soviet Union emerged as potential hegemon in Europe, the Cold War ensued. The United States played the key role in containing the Soviet Union, and then ushering it down the toilet bowl in the late 1980s and early 1990s when it fell apart. The United States was glad to be rid of the Soviet Union, just as it was glad to be rid of Nazi Germany, just as it was glad to be rid of Imperial Germany and Imperial Japan. Again, we do not tolerate peer competitors. And in fact, shortly after the Cold War ended, the administration of George H.W. Bush wrote some defense guidance that was leaked to the Washington Post, which made it clear that the United States viewed itself as the most powerful state on the planet by far, and that it had every intention to remain the most powerful state on the planet. That's the way international politics works. Most countries, of course, don't have the wherewithal to behave the way the United States does. But if you do have the wherewithal, what you discover is that great powers expand, and they try to dominate their region of the world. That's what the United States did. Brings me to the third part of my talk, which is, what is China likely to do? My view is that China is going to imitate the United States. And remember, what we're talking about here is a situation 20, 30 years down the road where China is much more powerful than it is today. China is a paper tiger militarily today. It's not a very powerful state militarily. And we're talking about a situation where China turns into a giant Hong Kong, and then it translates that economic might into military might. First question you have to ask yourself is, do you think China's going to try and dominate Asia? Do you think China is going to want to be the most powerful state in Asia by far? For me, this is not even an interesting question. The Chinese remember what happened the last time they were weak. It was not pretty. The European great powers and Japan invaded China, carved it up, did all sorts of horrible things to the Chinese people. They would have been much better off, those Chinese, if they had been really powerful. But they weren't powerful, they were weak. If you're China and you have two choices, one is you're 10 times more powerful than Japan, that's one option. Or two, Japan is 2 times more powerful than you. Which do you think you take? Do you think this is even an interesting question? Chinese want to be really powerful. They're going to go to great lengths to dominate Asia. What they want to do is they want to write the rules in Asia the way we write the rules in the Western Hemisphere. This does not mean that China's going to go on a rampage and try and conquer every country in the region. No, that's not going to happen. What China's going to try and do is make sure it is by far the most powerful country in Asia, and that no other state has the military capability to threaten it. China's going to want to create a situation where it's surrounded with the equivalent of Canada and Mexico, because that's the best way to survive. And what about the Monroe Doctrine? You think the Chinese are going to have a Monroe Doctrine? I think they are. By the way, the Japanese explicitly had a Monroe Doctrine of their own in the 1930s. They talked in exactly those terms. You think the Chinese are going to be happy with a situation where the United States runs aircraft carriers and airplanes up and down their coastline and has troops stationed right off the Chinese mainland? Think the Chinese are going to be happy with that? We're not happy. Whenever a European great power moves military forces into the Western Hemisphere, when I was young and the Soviets used to put military forces in Cuba, it drove the United States of America stark raving crazy. Who are these Soviets to come into the Western Hemisphere? This is our hemisphere. That's what the Monroe Doctrine is all about. Well, my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And if we have a Monroe Doctrine, and we don't want great powers wandering into our backyard, why do you think the Chinese are going to be happy with the United States sitting on their doorstep? They're not going to be. They're going to do everything they can to push us out of Asia, push us out into the Western Pacific. Is that because they're evil? Of course not. It's because they're going to figure out, if they haven't already figured out, that the best way to survive in the system is to be really powerful. It's to dominate your neighborhood and not have other great powers on your doorstep. So in this hypothetical situation where China gets to be much more powerful than it is today, it's going to be inclined. It's going to be inclined to push the United States out of Asia. Now this brings us to the question of, how do you think the Americans are likely to react? We have a rich history here, and the history coincides with my theory. And that is to say, the United States does not tolerate peer competitors. We will go to great lengths to make sure that China does not dominate Asia the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. You all know that last year Barack Obama decided that we were going to pivot to Asia. Is this surprising? Is this surprising? No, you know, the United States tells the Chinese that our pivot to Asia had nothing to do with containing China. Nobody with a triple-digit IQ would believe this. Our pivot to Asia was explicitly designed to contain China. The United States is determined to make sure that if China continues to rise and begins to throw its weight around in Asia, as we expect it to, that we will be there to contain them. Because again, we do not want China to dominate Asia. What about China's neighbors? You can already see what's happening with China's neighbors. They are very nervous about a rising China. And we now have very good relations with Vietnam, which we fought a war with in the 1960s and early 1970s. Very good relations with Singapore, India. I often ask students, why is it that the United States has excellent relations with India today and had bad relations with India during the Cold War? And students will say, oh, it's because India is a democracy and America is a democracy. But that argument doesn't work, in large part because India was a democracy during the Cold War and America was a democracy during the Cold War. Yet they had bad relations. They're both democracies now and they have good relations. So it can't be that fact that India and America are both democracies that explains the good relations today. What explains the good relations today is China. The Indians live in mortal fear of the Chinese. And the Chinese and the Americans are beginning to come together because they both fear China. The balancing coalition that's going to come together to contain China is going to include the Russians, it's going to include the Indians, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Singaporeans, Vietnam, the Philippines. That'll be the balancing coalition. Now, the problem that you face in this situation is that anything we do and China's neighbors do to contain China will look like encirclement to the Chinese. To put it in slightly different terms, anything that we do for defensive purposes will look offensive to the Chinese. And of course, anything that the Chinese do to defend themselves will look offensive to us and to China's neighbors. As many of you know, this is the classical security dilemma. The classical security dilemma says that what one country does to defend itself appears to the other country to be offensive in nature. So what's going to happen here as China continues to rise and it begins to exercise its muscle and it begins to build military forces, what it thinks are for defensive purposes. It's interested in survival after all, it's for defense. What it does for defensive purposes will appear to us to be offensive in nature. And anything we do, again, this is containment, anything we do to contain China will appear to them as offensive in nature. Again, it will look like encirclement. So my argument is that as China continues to grow economically, and it translates that economic might into military might, you are going to get an intense security competition between China and the United States, and more broadly between China on one hand and the United States and China's neighbors on the other. It's going to look a lot like the Cold War. Not completely, but it's going to look a lot like the Cold War. It's going to be a very dangerous security competition, which is going to have significant potential for war. Let me conclude by saying that the story I have told you revolves around my theory of great power politics. Again, I don't think you can answer the question of whether China can rise peacefully without a theory. So my story is based on my theory of international politics. But as many of you in the audience know, all of our social science theories are rather crude devices. We do not have a body of really good theories. And what that means is that sometimes our theories are wrong. My theory is not right all the time. My gut instinct is that my theory is right about 75% of the time. And 25% of the time, my theory is wrong. This is just the way social science works. What this means is that the story I told you might be wrong. I don't think so, but I think there is a small chance that my theory is wrong. Given what a grim story I just told you, let's hope that my theory proves wrong in this case. Thank you.